So welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. We're so excited to have an episode here to discuss the practice of do-overs, which we believe make grading for learning possible. As you may have seen in the blog post, 3 ways to make the switch to grading for learning. We're not talking about endless freebies. We're talking about structured practices that allow learners to reassess in ways that support growth of academic as well as of self-efficacy skills.
To help explore this topic today, we have 2 thought leaders joining us, Ken O'Connor and Dr. VaShawn Smith.
It's my pleasure to welcome our guest, Ken O'Connor. How are you, Ken?
Good, thank you, Lindsay. Good to be here.
Great. So Ken is a well-known author, speaker, consultant, and general thought leader around improving grading practices. He founded Assess for Success, and he works to support educators all over the world in supporting student learning through better assessment and reporting. You may have read one of his books. I know I have, and I hear VaShawn has too. A Repair Kit for Grading, 15 Fixes for Broken Grades, or How to Grade for Learning. Both of these are widely, among others, are widely considered to be some of the most effective learning resources for helping educators to shift these practices. So Ken, tell us a little bit about where you're joining us from today.
I am joining you from sunny but chilly Toronto. I live in an 11th floor condominium apartment in the East End, and I have a lovely view over Lake Ontario.
Wonderful. Tell us, maybe, is there something you'd like to share with our viewers or listeners about you, your family, your community?
I think probably, relevant, and maybe adding to the introduction that you did is that I think is probably relevant at the time is that I'm a grandfather. I have, my grand-twins are in grade 8, and my granddaughter is in junior kindergarten. And so I'm in some ways reliving school through their experiences. And of course, this has been an interesting year because although most of the time they've been in-person school, they have had periods of time when they've been online. So it's been very interesting to see how that's worked out.
I can imagine. Quite a year.
And I haven't really seen them since December the 26th, except on Zoom, because we have been in stay-at-home lockdown since December the 26th. Today is the day we're supposed to hear whether we will have some change in our restrictions starting next Tuesday.
Ah, interesting. Fingers crossed. But it's interesting also to add that layer of context when we think about listening to these recordings in future years. This is a year to remember. And finally, maybe share with our viewers and listeners, what are some of your current education passions, projects, things you're researching, learning about?
Well, my current passion is, I think, what has become or has been my passion since 1995. Way back then, when part of my job was a curriculum coordinator for assessment for a school district, I read an article that was entitled Guidelines for Grading. It was written by a professor from a college near Chicago, and I didn't think it made a lot of sense. So I wrote a brief letter to the editor, and she wrote back and said, if you've got some ideas, why don't you write an article? Well, at that point, I was just into criticizing. I wasn't into, writing anything. And a few months later, she sent me the responses of the professor to my criticisms. And I thought his responses made even less sense than his original article. And again, she said, why don't you write an article? Well, twice challenged, I felt I had to respond. And so I did some research, wrote an article that was published in the NAS Bulletin in May of 1995. And little did I know then that would be my sort of professional passion now for, I guess, going on 26 years.
Very, very interesting. It'd be fun to go back and look at that article and learn your journey. So thank you.
Yeah.
And I get to welcome our guest, Dr. VaShawn Smith, who is principal of Grandview Middle School in Missouri. I believe you're joining us from that spot right there, looks like. He's also a member of Phi Beta Sigma and founder of the AOS podcast, which is a series hosted by 3 Black male education leaders discussing education and the realist movement. Ken and VaShawn have recently been on another panel discussing several of the same key themes from today. So it's great to have you both with us. VaShawn, would you tell us a little bit more about maybe your favorite things in your office? I can see right there about school, where you're joining us from today.
So like Ken, I'm joining you from Grandview Middle School. It's a cloudy but nice day here in Kansas City, Missouri. Grandview's right outside of Kansas City. And I'm on the first floor of the school overlooking the parking lot. I don't have a Lake Ontario sitting outside my window. But if you were to come to my office, you will see basically my 2 passions. One, my fraternity. I'm a member of Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated, where I'm also the Director of Education for the state of Missouri and Kansas for the fraternity. And then you will see a lot of the University of Michigan. I am a diehard University of Michigan fan. I bleed maize and blue. No, I did not get to go to the University of Michigan, but I grew up. So you will see both of those things plastered everywhere in my office and a bunch of quotes as well. One of my very close that I hold near and dear to my heart. It was kind of our motto for my first year's principal here at Grandview last year. But it is the quote is, we are what we repeatedly do. So therefore, excellence then is not an act but a habit. So always constant to be great at what we do.
Oh, I like that. I'm going to have to hang on to that. Awesome. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about yourself, your family, your community?
Just a little bit about myself. Like I said, this is my 16th year in education. Like I said, me and Ken was on another panel a few weeks ago. And it was my first time actually meeting Ken in person. And, they tell you never meet your heroes, but Ken was actually one of the first researchers and authors that I actually read in my education career. It was actually my second year. And my assistant principal came to me with this book called How to Grade for Learning. And me and my POC at that time dug into it. And we started to incorporate some of those practices as a pilot program in our school. And that's kind of really laid the foundation for my education journey and career. And I continue as I moved and progressed in my career, held on to a lot of those same beliefs in my classroom. And then when I became an administrator, things that I want to incorporate in the buildings that I've worked in. So it's an amazing opportunity to be sitting on one, but now 2 panels with the guru of grading for learning, in my opinion, Ken OConnor. So he's like the Yoda of grading for learning.
He's blushing.
But yeah, so other than that, I mean, I'm very passionate about education and just growing education. I'm also, like I said, I have a blog. I'm the Expelled Principal, which is the inner thoughts of a middle school principal who was expelled from middle school himself. It really just talks a lot about my journey as a first-year principal last year. There's some stuff in there about one of my big passions is building school community and really bringing parent voice back into the schools and tearing down those barriers between the school and parents. So a lot of the blog posts speak to a lot of those different things. So my next blog post, give you a little preview, as we come up on the 1 year anniversary of pandemic learning, is next week I will be interviewing 20 of my students and writing a blog post about their view of what pandemic learning has been like for them.
Wow.
I love that.
Can't wait to see it. Can't
I
wait.
love incorporation of the student voice. Oftentimes there's just, well, here's what the effect on students has been without asking the students. I think I also read, was it your dissertations around trauma-informed practice? Trauma-informed school?
Yes, my dissertation work, I did a policy analysis of all 50 states and their incorporation of trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive schooling policies and practices, and really try to say the crux of the research was we put a lot of money into the instructional things that go on. We all remember No Child Left Behind, or we can go back to Common Core and all those different things like that. But we don't put the same amount of effort, energy, or money behind things like trauma sensitive and social emotional learning and things like that. It was crazy to find out that over 50% of our states have no kind of policy or procedure to help guide schools on how to incorporate those practices into their building.
Well, we're going to have to talk about that more because part of my dissertation was about trauma-informed practice too.
Just going to say, I think we have 2 thinking minds here. 2 more, I should say.
All right. Thank you very much, VaShawn. And we're going to jump into some questions next.
All right. It's already getting so good, so thank you. Ken, I'd love to begin with you. So, your well-known book, 15 Fixes for Broken Grades, describes some key practices which we would say address the distortion of achievement. Tell us a little bit about the underlying philosophy or reasons behind these practices that you suggest as they relate to ensuring accurate communication of student learning.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, I mean, my basic idea, and as I said, to go back to 1995, was that I became to realize that grades are in many ways broken. They include ingredients that distort it. Traditionally, they've included ingredients to distort achievement. They've come from poorly organized or low quality evidence. They've been based very often on inappropriate calculation, and they really haven't supported learning and supported students. The whole process has been about numbers, points and percentages, and precision in calculation, and that really didn't serve us very well. Not only did it not give us grades that were accurate, it really distorted the purpose of schools. I mean, I think, although it's probably in more recent years that schools have focused a lot on having mission and vision statements, but even without mission and vision statements, I think any principal, VaShawn hopefully will agree with me, would have said that the school was about learning. But if we looked at the practices and the impact of those practices, school wasn't about learning. School was a grading game, not a learning game. And so my thinking was, there are things we can do that can change this. There are things that we can do that make grades accurate. There are things that we can do that make grades meaningful. There are things that can make them consistent. And there are things that can make the assessment grading process supportive of learning. And so the whole idea of the 15 fixes was to point in fairly specific ways at how the assessment and grading process could be changed to achieve those ends.
Super. I'll say I find that it's incredibly approachable, and that mindset of things that people can practically take away, it breaks it down into such an understandable format. It breaks it down conceptually, and it puts tools in teachers' hands that they really could begin to make this shift in practice.
Yeah, the idea was that it was going to be practical. It was for practicing teachers, that it's a fairly small book, which means that it doesn't deal with every aspect in detail, but I think it has the key ideas, and it has been well received. I think the most common criticism that I've had of it is that each of the fixes starts negatively, and that it would be better to emphasize the positive, which in most parts is the second part of the fix. But the way I looked at it was about identifying what was wrong, right, and then how could we fix it. But I've had some interesting discussions about that with some people.
I can imagine. Interesting. VaShawn, I'd love to hear you respond to that, but also share within your response, if you will, what are some of your experiences from your work as a school leader? You've referred
so
go ahead.
So first, like I said, we talked about How to Grade for Learning was one of my first books that I dove into as an educator and really understood true research and practice. And you just mentioned, the 15 fixes. So I have it right here, and I can show you it's well highlighted and everything like that, as I've dove in and dug into it in great detail. The one thing that I would like to highlight first with this in practice and being a school leader, really trying to get my teachers, is I start in all this conversation with fix number 8. That's kind of where things start for me. And fix number 8 really talks about, and I'll just read it for you. Don't assign grades using inappropriate or unclear performance standards. Provide clear descriptions of achievement expectations. And the question I always ask back to my teachers is, do you know what is it that you want kids to do and know? Is it based on a standard? Can you yourself unpack and understand that standard? And then how are you communicating that level of achievement to students? And then when we unpack that standard, do we understand the foundational knowledge that goes into reaching that standard and piece of that there? So that's kind of where things start and end with me with the fixes, really making sure we first, as educators, understand what we want kids to know. But then how do we communicate that to all stakeholders in a language that they understand. So when I talk to my students, I'm putting in student-friendly language. When I talk to my parents, I'm not using acronym or educational jargon. I'm really making sure that those stakeholders understand what it is we're trying to achieve in 6th grade math, in 7th grade ELA, in PE, in Project Lead the Way, all those classes, so that kids know. And I think when a kid knows what the expectation is and where the bar is, they're more apt to actually reach up and grab it. And I think that's going to kind of, we're going to talk a little bit later on about, motivation and things like that, and how sometimes grading for learning gets a bad rap because it does kill that. But I think when you make the learning very concrete and clear for students and get away from that abstract thinking, it really enhances that. And then my other piece that I wanted to hit upon with the fixes is fix number 15. You have to include students in the grading process. We have to make them, help them have some ownership in that process. So one of the things we're doing, and I want, try to get into all of it at one time, but is we're just now starting the process in my school, in my district, of building performance skills through the priority standards. And as we do that, the thing I keep taking teachers back to is these skills need to be student friendly. A student needs to be able to clearly read this and know what the achievement level is, and then be able to chart a path from where they're at to where they need to get to go. So those are the two fixes that I always have been highlighting here this year as we kind of make the shift from traditional grading to a more standards reference grading practices in my building.
I love that. And, it just strikes to me too, it's a powerful practice for empowering student learners. When we speak about this idea that we want to engage them in the learning process and that empower them to understand where they can move forward, grades are a source of communication that can actually deliver upon that. And Ken, you're welcome to respond if you have something you'd like to add to that.
I would agree completely with what VaShawn said. For yesterday and this morning, I was participating in an online conference, and called the STAGGR conference, Standards, Targets, Assessment, Grading and Reporting. And the keynote speaker yesterday, who was Myron Duick, who is out of British Columbia, started off by saying that if students don't understand what they're supposed to be learning, the whole process is useless. And I think, in a sense, that's what VaShawn said, but that was sort of the theme that Myron used to run through his whole keynote, and it certainly came out in other sessions in the conference. And I think that, that is such a critical message. And the way I like to focus it now is, if those learning goals are clear, both the what and the how well, and we've involved students in the process, age appropriately, starting from the earliest ages, students should be able to answer 3 questions. Where am I going? Where am I now? What do I do to close the gap or get better? And if I went into a classroom in VaShawn's school, I believe I would know things are working if I could ask any kid in the classroom that I went to those questions and they were able to answer them. What would happen if I went in and asked those questions, VaShawn?
I would say in my 6th grade classrooms, a lot of those kids will be able to answer that because they have been doing what they thought was standards reference grading, but really is criteria reference grading is what they've been doing. And that was one of the things we had to help them understand the difference between criterion reference, standards reference, and standards based. So that was part of the PD on Wednesday, is really clearing up some of the misconceptions. But I think in my 6th grade classes, kids will clearly be able to tell you, where they need to go and where they're at, and then start to articulate how to chart that they're charting that path to get there. In my 7th and 8th grade classes, which we'll get to in the next question, I don't think they will be as well versed in doing that because of the way we do traditional grading at the 7th and 8th grade level. So don't want to give too much of the thunder away for the next question. But I think just to kind of answer your point, I think in 6th grade, a lot of those kids will be able to answer those questions for you. In 7th and 8th grade, they may struggle. Maybe 8th grade more than 7th, because 7th grade have just left 6th, where they've done it a little bit, and now they're kind of transitioning over. But I also want to make a point, Lindsay, that you said about communication, the communication piece. And then that was another piece on Wednesday that we wanted to make sure we drove home to teachers that grades is just a form of communication. It is a way of giving feedback to students. It's not an end-all, be-all. It's not, it doesn't define who a student is. It's just one data point that we use to communicate where kids are at. And that was the piece that we really had to help teachers make a shift from, is that we would use grades to report out where kids are at that moment in time. Mm-hmm. And I emphasize that several different times, at that moment in time, because not all kids learn the exact same way on the exact same time frame.
Yes. Oh, wonderful. Your teachers are lucky to have you, my friend. That's great. Thank you both.
I hope they understand that.
I also want to point out we did not even pay Ken to mention Myron, who we talked to earlier this week. Thank you, Ken, for pulling a bow around that, making the connection to our other guests we've had to talk to. So thank you. All right, VaShawn, we're going to go on to the next question, and I'd love you to respond first. Given the historic interruption to educational practices over the past year, hundreds of schools and districts have been forced to rethink grading policies and practices, which can be an excellent opportunity to start or to continue the grading for learning journey. At the same time, we also want to acknowledge there can be hesitation around grading for learning practices. For example, there can be concerns that practices such as reassessment or do-overs or flexible due dates will decrease achievement, diminish motivation, and not prepare students for the real world. So what examples can you provide that might address these concerns?
So the first example I want to start with, and this is what really drove home the point for me, and I was like, the system that I'm in, this is my second year here, is that we were doing something wrong. And it happened back in October during parent-teacher conferences. And COVID has done a lot of different things, but it's also opened our eyes to a lot of different things as well. And what COVID allowed us to do is we went to an all virtual parent-teacher conferences where we tripled the amount of participation we had in parent-teacher conferences, because people didn't have to come to a building. We have to worry about babysitters and things like that. And we do have a high, we are a Title I school, so we have a high low socioeconomic status students. But as I said in those conferences, something struck me as I kind of reflected. When I said in sixth grade conferences, I kept hearing this happen. And I'll just kind of sum it up, is the teacher would say, I gave this assessment and your kid, they were mastery on this standard. They were near mastery on this standard. They were remedial on this standard. And here's how they can go from remedial to near mastery, or from near mastery to mastery, or how they can maintain mastery. And parents were like, well, what activities can they do? What resources do you have to help them get to mastery? And then when I said in 7th and 8th grade conferences where they're doing traditional grading, it was your kid has a 78% in this class and they don't have this assignment done and they don't have this test completed. It was all about point chasing. It wasn't about the learning that took place. And it really just coalesced today for me as I had a summer evaluation with one of my teacher of the year from last year, who was a phenomenal teacher. But she said she sat down with a girl to do her data talk after an assessment she gave. And the young lady said that she had been up late studying for this assessment. And the percentage that she got was like a 74%. But yet she scored mastery on these standards. And when it's like the 74% didn't mean anything when she showed her, like, you were master on these standards here. And she saw all the green circles. And it was like, and the comment that the student made was, I guess that studying paid off. Like, even though she didn't get 100%, even though she didn't get 90%, for the fact that we can say, hey, you still got some growing to do in these areas, but look at all these areas you have mastered. Look at all these skills you do have. And that just really kind of showed me, like, that's the movement we need to make towards a more getting away from point chasing and percentages that are so subjective, in my opinion. The other thing that I talk to my teachers about on Wednesday as we kind of launched this 6-part series we're doing with PD around learning. A lot of times when you talk to people about, I don't want to give kids a redo, or we don't want kids to be able to reassess, or we don't want to have flexible due dates and things like that, is because, well, we've always done it this way. Well, just because you've always done something that way doesn't mean it's right. And I tell them, I said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. You've always done it this way, and you've always had only 30% of your kids score proficient on state assessments. You've always done it this way, and you've only got a 28% return rate on your homework. So doing it that way obviously isn't working for the majority of our students, so we have to rethink how we're doing it. So those would be some of the things that I would kind of lead with. And then that real world piece, which just sometimes just burns me up. But this is the analogy that I gave on Wednesday. I said, when you turn 16, everybody's excited about getting their license on 16. Everybody. So you went to the DMV on your 16th birthday and you took that driver's test and you failed it. The DMV didn't say, well, sorry, you don't ever get a driver's license. You're done. You can't ever drive a car. No, they let you come back and take that test as many times as you needed to until you pass it. And it may have took you another 2 times, another 3 times. It may have took you till you was 21. It didn't matter when you finally passed it. When you passed it, you got your license. So why is it that we hold students in the classroom to this strict timetable that you must learn how to add, subtract integers only in the first quarter of 7th grade? Or you must be able to write a summary, complex summary with cited evidence and only in 7th grade ELA? Why do we put time frames on learning for kids when we know for a fact that that's not how the real world really operates?
I completely agree. As someone who did not pass my permit test the first time, and I also the second time I went back, I did it in a different modality. Like the first time was written, second time on the computer, and I I can drive now. Absolutely, that's a concrete example I can identify with. Ken, what would you like to add to that?
Well, I think to some extent, VaShawn took my example because I was going to use a driver's license example as well. But I think why it's important is that to recognize that the world outside of school is a world of second chances. You know, lawyers can take the bar exam as many times as they want. Doctors going for specialists can do the specialist, whatever is required, a number of times. So that this idea that reassessment or redos are not, how shall I put it, real, is really false. I mean, in the world outside of school, proficiency and quality is more important than doing it the first time. I mean, one of the things that pointed that out to me was when I was a curriculum coordinator, responsible to what we called the superintendent of program, what I guess would be a director in the US, because for us, directors are the top and the superintendents are underneath. And I had to write reports for him. And fairly early in my tenure, it came back and was sitting on my desk and said, this needs to be done again. These parts of it are not clear or concise enough. Now, I was a little bit, shocked that I hadn't done it right, but there was no criticism. There was no, you're not doing your job. It was just, here's what needs to be done, do it again. And that really sort of had a big impact on me. But my driver's example is driver's license is one that I use a lot when I'm doing presentations. I failed my driver's license test the first time, and I didn't even get out of the parking lot. I parked so close to the curb that it took me 4 goes, backing back and forth to get out. And unbeknownst to me, the standard was 2. So I was told I'd failed and to get out of the car, which I did a little bit reluctantly. But I immediately booked an appointment for a week later, and I'm pleased to tell you I passed when I went back. But so the second chance was there. But what I think is important to point out about that is that there were some things involved between the first test and the second test. I did corrective. I did an awful lot of practicing of parking in that week. If I hadn't practiced, if I hadn't done correctives, I probably would have failed again. So one of the things we have to be clear about with reassessment in schools is there must be some relearning before there's a reassessment, or it's a waste of time. To do that reassessment, to do that retest, it took time. It took time to do the practicing parking. It took time to go back for the test. And I actually had to pay the second time. Now, we can't charge the kids, but the principle is the same. So I think, the conditions that were involved there was there had to be correctives or I would have failed again. And there was opportunity cost. It cost me time and money. And I think those are what needs to be in place when we have reassessment in schools. Students have to do correctives. There has to be relearning, and it doesn't have to be terribly formal, but there must be some evidence of relearning. And it doesn't have to be. I mean, I think that's an absolute. The opportunity cost is an optional, but it's not just, well, you're automatically going to have a second chance. That just continues a game. Well, we'll see what happens the first time and we'll only try on the second. Okay?
I like that opportunity cost. That connects, for me, an argument I hear is, well, there's no reassessment in college. And I want to push back. Yes, there is. You can take that course again. It's going to cost you, but you can redo it. You can redo it as many times as you have the money for. So I like the opportunity cost phrasing. Thank you.
I think also just driving it home and we talked about doctors examining, Ken talked about the doctor and the lawyers like that. Just talking to teachers, not all of you passed the practice or your state of certification the first time. Some of you had to take it multiple times before you got that license. The state didn't just tell you, oh, you failed the first time, you'll never be able to teach. You had opportunities to do it. So somehow, and one of the arguments that I have with a teacher, not an argument, but heated conversation on their behalf, was just, well, when I was in school, this is the way we done it. Okay. And that was like probably 30 years ago. Like, when you were in school, you were probably walking up a hill to both ways in the middle of the snow, so like things do change and we learn more, when you know better, you do better.
Absolutely.
And can I pick up on that for a moment? Because I think that's really important. I mean, the argument that we should be doing it the way it was done, and which often is sort of what we get from parents without them saying that, because all they know is what school was like when they were in school. Those teachers that you're talking about, VaShawn, probably should know better because they're in school now. But the parents really only know school as it was when they were there. But now, even in the last, some of the things we've learned with COVID, but certainly in the last 20 years, we've learned so much more about how children learn, about the brain, about how we can use assessment effectively. And to suggest that we would be doing things the way we did it in the past, when we know so much more, is so totally illogical. We have to take advantage. It doesn't mean that yesterday was wrong. It just means that we can make tomorrow better. And I will pretty much always acknowledge that when I talk about the things that I think we should be doing in assessment and grading, having reassessment, for example, those are not things I did when I was in the classroom, because when I was in the classroom was quite a long time ago. But I didn't know any better. I think I was doing probably as good a job as anybody based on what we knew then. But when I think back, some of the things I did were absolutely horrible.
I think you made a point too, again, like, I don't want it to come across that way that we're telling teachers you're doing something wrong. Like, we're not putting a judgment call on, but it's saying what you are doing can be enhanced.
Yeah.
So that's like, I don't ever want people to feel like, oh, you're doing wrong. That's what they, it's me and my admins, if we go in the classroom and we provide PD, we're not saying what you're doing is wrong. We're saying what we are doing can be enhanced and be done better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to emphasize the word wrong, but I say that because sometimes when you suggest to somebody, hopefully in a very professional way, that maybe they could think about doing something different, there is somewhat of a negative reaction, and then they say, oh, you're saying what I did was wrong. No, I'm saying that we can do it better, partly because we know more now. And if that was all I knew then, I wasn't doing it wrong. I was doing it the best way I knew. So that's really what I meant when I talked about wrong.
And I hear you, and I agree with that. There's a great quote that I often refer to, and I'm going to forget who said it right now, of course, but is, do your best until you know better, and then do better. We're not perfect. None of us are coming from a position where we said, oh, we've always had it figured out. Not at all, right? We're all learning too. And so I appreciate that perspective. And it also perfectly leads into my next question, but I'm going to zero in on it a little bit more too. We're certainly, a lot of teachers are out there listening to this, and I would imagine you would agree with me here. We've seen a lot of press this year of pushback from teachers around this mindset of offering reassessment or flexible policies for students to show what they know. And so when we think about practical advice for teachers, for instance, a common response might be, it's just going to massively increase my workload. And certainly I can understand where they're coming from. I have practical ideas to potentially suggest, but Ken, I'd love to hear from you. I know you certainly have areas to support teachers in this way. What are some practical things that you would say to a teacher that brought that point up?
Well, I believe absolutely that reassessment should be available, and it should be taken advantage of when it's necessary, because it sends the message that the learning isn't over. If you're not where you want to be, where I want you to be, then there are ongoing opportunities. If we say there's no reassessment or no relearning, we're basically saying it's over, and well before it should be over. But I do understand the concern about the amount of work that's involved, and I think we always should be trying to do things where teachers are working smarter, not harder. And so I think, although, as I said, I believe very strongly in reassessment, I think we should be doing everything we can to avoid having to do formal reassessment. That it's sort of the last step. Now, it may be the last step because of timing. It's the end of a grading period, or it's coming near and so we need that information to be able to determine the grades because the district or the school requires that I do that. But I think as much as possible, we should avoid it. And the way we avoid it is through how well we go through that teaching learning cycle. The better we provide feedback, the better we provide relearning opportunities, the better we have a true teaching learning cycle before we do evaluative assessment, the less likely it is that we will need to have formal reassessment opportunities. Equally, if we are based on learning goals, standards-based, standards referenced, if a student doesn't do well on a standard on an assessment, almost inevitably we are spiraling our assessments. We're going to be assessing that standard again in 3 weeks' time, in 6 weeks, in 9 weeks. Well, if we're spiraling the assessment, we have other opportunities to get the same evidence. We don't need to do a reassessment. So those are the ways in which I think we avoid it. And then we make it manageable by requiring correctives and by maybe putting some opportunity cost attached to it. And then it's not, even when we have to do it, it's not overwhelming for teachers. Okay?
That's great. Thank you. VaShawn, what do you think?
So I think Ken brought up a good point when he talked about like reassessment shouldn't be the automatic go-to. You know, I think when people hear reassessment and things like that, they automatically think, oh, this kid's going to get to take this test as many times as they want to until eventually they pass. I think of reassessment as a spare tire. So on my car, like there's things that I do. I take my car to get it serviced. I get the tires rotated. I check the tire pressure. And then as I get it serviced, they might say, hey, this tire's wearing down. You might want to go ahead and get a replacement. So I get a replacement. And then if something happens out of the blue, a nail hits my car, something like that, and it goes flat, then I have a spare to help me out. So as a teacher in the classroom, you should be doing everything you can to front load the assessment so that just in case if something happened, the kid had a bad day, you know, something happened, that night before they didn't get enough sleep, anything that could have took place, then the reassessment is that spare tire, that emergency kit that you can go to give them another chance to demonstrate what they know. And I'm a firm believer, and I tell teachers this all the time, is that when you give an assessment, you should not be surprised by what that kid gets. You should already have an idea in your mind on what that kid's going to get on that assessment and know where you're going to have to give interventions and things like that. So if you think this kid with practice activities has done a phenomenal job and you've charted their growth through the unit and then on something they bombed it, you as a teacher should know something's wrong, something's off. Let me pull out this spare tire to try to figure out how I can give that kid another opportunity to show and demonstrate the learning that they did know and demonstrate it on all the practice activities before we got to this assessment.
I think that's such a great analogy. Thank you, VaShawn.
I know, I love it.
And one of the ways I would think about that, and you talked about the front loading, what you do, you have your car serviced, you rotate the tires and so on. I can't remember the last time I had to use a spare tire, and I suspect that's the same for you, partly because cars are better than they were, maybe 30 years ago. I can think back to a time when I was having to use a spare tire fairly frequently, partly because I probably wasn't looking after I was young and stupid, wasn't looking after my car as well as I should, and the cars weren't as well made. And so if the car's well made and we look after it, we don't have to use the spare tire. And I think that's a great analogy for what you were describing as we relate it to the classroom.
Agree. I had a colleague who would say, invest in the pre-takes, and then you don't have to use the retakes.
I like it.
All around the same thing.
I think, I've also heard teachers speak of a misconception where they assume they need to reassess on everything, right? You don't need to reassess on everything. You need to reassess potentially on the areas that the student isn't showing learning of. And if the feedback cycle they're in, of course, is working, they are going to be able to articulate that as well.
And if a teacher tells me that I have to reassess everything, that means you didn't understand what that assessment was about. Because that assessment should be tied directly to standards and targets so that if a kid didn't get this question right or these questions right, this is the standard that they're missing or their level of missing. So a test might assess 3 standards. We're not saying just because a kid didn't pass that assessment, they need to go back and do all 3 standards. They might have shown mastery on 2 of them, and now we only have to assess this 1 standard in a smaller formative assessment where they can demonstrate that learning. So I think that's the piece great assessment writing, I think is a way to not have to worry about reassessment or reassessing everything.
And I think part of that, Lindsay, is, and I think about something that was on, I can't remember whether it was on the Facebook group or a Twitter thread, where somebody said, we reassess on all formative and summative assessments. I cannot understand for the life of me why you would ever reassess a formative assessment.
Exactly.
That was a point in time assessment to see where the student was at.
Exactly.
It wasn't to make judgments about where the student is, but however they did on it, you've got some information that you can then use to work with that student, and information that you can give to the student for what they need to do. And the idea you would have a reassessment of a formative assessment just totally blows my mind.
Yeah, but I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's important for people to hear. That's maybe a common misconception. Thank you.
Yeah,
I think that's the misconception. Yeah.
And what I noticed coming up in your responses are some amazing connections to equity. We haven't brought up the E word yet, but do you want to explain in your words these practices we're discussing? What does it have to do with, how's it integrated with educational equity? And
well, I think it's integrated around our understanding of what is fairness. And we've very often had a serious misunderstanding about fairness in education. We have equated fairness with uniformity. We are fair when all the rules apply to the students in all the same way. In assessment, they all do the same assessment and at the same time in the same amount of time. And when people are different, and students obviously are different, to have everything the same is actually unfair. It's got to be about equity of opportunity. And if we want success for all students, we have to acknowledge that they're different and recognize that Lindsay may need something different than Erin, than VaShawn. And that's not unfair. That is providing equity of opportunity. And for me, one of the critical ones in that is not that it's specific to the reassessment, but is the issue of time on formal assessments. Now, when we say a test has to be done in 45 minutes, and you have some students who are fast writers and quick thinkers, and you have other students who are slow writers and methodical, reflective thinkers, you have a completely unfair situation. And so, I believe what we should be doing is providing flex time, not fixed time. But that same principle applies to virtually everything we do. We're dealing with individuals. We're not dealing with when we want every individual to be successful.
I like that. I like that even
So, I think with the equity piece, giving teachers the language and tools to be able to explain that to kids as well. So I think that's some of the pushback that teachers give, is because kids aren't going to understand why this kid over here got this while this kid getting it. And one of the greatest examples that I've ever seen by a teacher, and it has stuck with me all these years, is when a teacher was talking about equity. It was actually in a CWC class with a co-teacher, and they were wondering why this kid's over here got to use a calculator, or this kid got to get extra time with this teacher. She was like, if Jimmy got a cut and Jimmy needed a Band-Aid, do I pass out a Band-Aid to everybody, or do I just give Jimmy a Band-Aid? Well, just Jimmy needs a Band-Aid because Jimmy's the only one that got cut. And that's like the easy, that makes it so, we think of equity as this big thing, but that just made it so simple in kid language, and kids are still, oh, well, I don't need a calculator because I understand my multiplication facts. So they may not understand theirs, and we're not learning multiplication facts right now. Right now, we're solving equations, so they get this added bonus or this added tool to help them get there, because that's what they need the extra thing. And I think I've seen that like 5-6 years ago, and that just, anytime I explain equity, I always go back to that analogy that I seen used by that teacher.
Yeah, the example I've sometimes used when I've been doing live presentations, live workshops, which I've almost forgotten how that happened, is if I thought of equity of opportunity in accessing whatever I was putting on a screen, the PowerPoint slides I was using, if I thought equity was being the same for everybody, I would have done one of two things. I would have either insisted that anybody that had glasses on take their glasses off, or I would have insisted that everybody put glasses on. Now, both of those would be absurd. Some people, to be able to access the screen, needed glasses, as I do. Some didn't, but we don't have a problem with that. It's not uniform, but it's equitable.
I love those examples.
Another great example I'm going to use.
Tires and glasses. I like it. Lindsay, I want to take in on our time. I could talk all day, ask questions all day. Should we jump to question 5?
Well, I tell you what, let's head that way.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to move into asking you two, what do you wish we had asked that we didn't? And I'll start with you, Ken.
Maybe just taking some of the ideas around how we can make reassessment practical, how we can make it, as I said, teachers working not smarter, not harder. And I think an important part of that is the idea that the reassessment doesn't have to be exactly the same as the original assessment. And what I hear from teachers all the time is, you mean I have to design a whole new test? That's going to take me time to design it. It's going to take me time to score it when the student, well, it doesn't happen. I mean, quite apart from what VaShawn said about don't do it on everything, just do it on the standards that and I think one of the main things is that we have a variety of ways in which we can assess. And in middle school and high school, we tend to put almost all our eggs, or we have tended, in the product basket. It's either a test or it's something written. But for reassessment, I think one of the best ways, especially if I've only got 1 or 2 students who need reassessment, one of the best ways to do it is with oral assessment, with 2 or 3 well-crafted questions in 5 or 10 minutes. I can find out exactly what a student knows or does understand, can do. And so if you've just got a couple of kids that need reassessment, why do a paper and pencil test? Just have a couple of questions and sit down with them for 5 minutes. And then it's not a burden on a real burden on the teacher.
Thank you. VaShawn, what do you think? Something that we didn't ask that you wish we had, or would you like to add anything?
I think I'll just add on again that practical application piece. I know there's people out there listening saying, like, this all sounds great in theory, but what does it look like in practice? Great. And like I said, my second year teaching, I came across Ken O'Connor's book, and like I said, I've been sold ever since. And I'm going to tell you one of the practices that I did in the classroom. I'm not saying it was right; it was just one that I did. And I'm a big believer that students should demonstrate learning prior to an assessment. So I found it very difficult when I would call a parent and say, "Hey, I need your kid to stay after school to do this assignment, or they're missing these homework assignments. So can you please have them stay after school to make up this homework?" Parents are not very apt to make their kids stay after school to make up homework. So what I did was, when we had test day in the class, if you did not complete all the practice activities while everybody else was testing, you were working on those practice activities. I was there to give you feedback. I was there to give you one-on-one support so that I can see that you understood what we were doing before I put you in front of that assessment. And then I found out after that, when I called a parent and said, "Hey, I need your kid to stay after school to make up this test," they made the kid stay. So, I mean, that was just one thing that I did differently that helped me show that help students get the practice in before they did an assessment. But then also, if I needed extra time with them, they would be able to stay after school to get that. Why did I have to use after school time? I could use that test day and then they come after school to make up the assessment. The other thing that I would highlight that we already talked about is there has to be some kind of remediation activity prior to a reassessment. And I would tell kids, that's where that opportunity cost came in, is I don't mind, you can take this assessment 5 times if you want to, but you must come to X number of tutoring sessions with me prior to you're able to reassess again. So once again, putting the onus back on students, helping them take ownership that if you want this better grade, it's there for you, but you have to make the investment to get there. So we would always set out, and it depended on, how many standards we needed to reteach, what activities we needed to do on, but I would always say it was a predetermined number that I would give them. After you've done this many tutoring sessions and demonstrated this many things, we will allow you to do that reassessment. And I was I didn't average grades or anything like that. I just went ahead and gave you whatever that new grade was, because at that point in time, you demonstrated a new level of knowledge, not an average between the first time you took the assessment and this time. And then the last thing I did, because I wasn't in a school that did standards or criteria reference grading, we had traditional grading, is we gave, it was 10 points for homework, and then we would give up to 100 points for an assessment. So the kid, and I graded for accuracy on homework because I wanted to give you feedback on what you know and you didn't know. It wasn't just a completion grade. So if you got, say, 7 out of 10 on the homework activities for however many learning activities, and then you did that assessment, and you scored a 95, which means you knew 95% of the material, I would go back to those learning activities and change those to 9.5 because you demonstrated you knew 95% of the material. So why am I still penalizing you for those practice activities when that wasn't what you demonstrated at the end? So those are just some quick practical things that I've done in the classroom that worked for me, that I saw a lot more engagement and students taking ownership in their grading, in their activities and their learning in that process. So I just want to give a couple practical examples.
I appreciate that.
Can I just build on that point that VaShawn made a little bit as well? Because I think it relates to one of the things I would like to see eliminated from classrooms, and what I think a lot of teachers have seen in the last year, and that is the problems with averaging. And VaShawn overcame that by saying, okay, I had these scores for the formative assessments, but when they aced the summative assessment, that was what I used. I mean, I can think of students, for example, maybe what has been a fairly typical pattern, 3 quizzes and a test, and they all count for the grade. And because it's early in the learning, the student gets 30% on the first, and then they don't do better they get 60% on the second quiz and 70% on the third quiz, and then they get 90% on the test. If we average that, it's probably, I'm not doing arithmetic, it's probably 70% or lower. But that's the whole purpose of the process, is for them to learn and get better. And so that's why, and you emphasized it earlier, VaShawn, the idea that it's about what students know and understand now, emphasizing more recent evidence and that's really what happens also with reassessment, isn't it? We're emphasizing. So this whole idea that we get away from averaging and that we emphasize more recent evidence is, I think, a critical piece of this as well.
I am so glad you brought that up.
I have one more thing, because it was with the average thing, and I know, but there's another great resource that I'm currently diving into with this. So it's the School Leader's Guide to Standards-Based Grading, and in there, in the foreword to that book, we read that. My teachers read it in our Wednesday PD, but it talks about the averaging and the how that isn't fair. And the analogy they give, I'm not going to give the exact same analogy, but pretty much what I took from it was I have high blood pressure. And every so many months, I have to go get my blood pressure checked. But when I go get my blood pressure checked, they don't average what my pressure was last time. They say, what is your blood pressure this time? And now your blood pressure's down, you're doing better. They don't say, well, it was 200 last week and now it's 150 this week, so you have an average of 175. So just helping teachers understand the practicality of what they're doing in a different context helps them come to the light of, oh, well, maybe what I'm doing isn't correct. Or when you go get a physical, they don't average your cholesterol, your blood, your weight, all that, and then say, it's basically everything kind of stands on its own merit in that process. So
I'll just say I'm so glad both of you have been able to touch on that, because I feel like it does bring full circle what the ultimate point of reassessment is, right? We could really undermine that if we don't recognize the importance of not averaging grades too, and communicating back that most recent evidence of student learning. So thank you for that. Any last comments there, Erin, or anything, final comments there before we begin to, unfortunately, close it up?
Yeah, the practical examples and the connections to real world situations are super helpful.
Super. Well, I want to thank you both so much for joining us today. This has been an exceptionally great discussion between the two of you. I also, just for our audience out there, I want to highlight a couple of recommendations for resources. You've heard several mentioned today beyond these also, but certainly Ken's books are amazing and articles as well, for learning opportunities if you're considering this journey or if you're already in this journey and looking for deeper learning opportunities. Also, joining the Facebook group, Standards-Based Grading and Learning, is a great opportunity for communicating with other educators who are out there also going through this experience as well.
Can I just mention, Lindsay, on that? I happen to be one of the administrators of that group. And some time ago, we instituted that you have to answer 3 questions so that we know that you're an educator. So if you do apply, and you do have to apply to join the group, please answer the 3 questions. We're getting so many people who are saying they want to join, but they don't answer the questions. And we're not admitting them if they don't answer the questions.
But it's a worthy pursuit. If you answer those questions, there's thousands of educators in there, classroom teachers, practitioners, etc. VaShawn, any resources you would recommend beyond those we've discussed today?
So this is just one, like I said, the school leaders guide to standards-based grading. And then there is the counterpart to that. Give me one second. I just ordered 36 copies for my teachers. So hopefully it'll be here soon. It is the handbook for developing and using proficiency skills in the classroom. Is another amazing resource that is out there. It has real world, real practical skills and things like that for you to use. And then the last one I will put, so as Aaron said in the intro, I am the co-host of the AOS podcast, which we have just rebranded. It is now called the Engage podcast. And Engage stands for Educators Networking, Growing, and Guiding Enrichment. And we are offering free PD every 2 weeks on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So if you look me up on Twitter at Dr. V. Smith, you'll get all the information. But every 2 weeks, we provide free PD on a plethora of things to anyone that wants to join in on the podcast.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
And Lindsay, given you mentioned Facebook, can I mention 2 Twitter chats that I think are great?
They're wonderful.
SBL chat, hashtag SBL chat, first and third Wednesdays. Wonderful moderators, great questions. 2 nights ago, it was Matt Townsley from the University of Northern Iowa was the moderator, had wonderful provocations. The threads, the discussion was amazing. And then the other one is hashtag AT assessment, all things assessment. And again, that's alternate Tuesdays, both of them 9 o'clock Eastern. And the questions that they come up with just promote such deep thinking and some wonderful sharing of ideas and resources. So those 2 Twitter chats are great. And you participate, so you know that as well.
I was going to say, I have learned an incredible amount of things on those discussions. There's practitioners, there's experienced professionals out there sharing ideas. So I highly recommend all of those resources, actually.
And just real quick, Ken, when I sign up for the Facebook group, can I just put, I know Ken for my answers?
I'll think about that.
It'll be a true test. Oh, that's great. Well, we're looking forward to our next episode. We're going to continue helping teachers put practical strategies to work as we discuss how to use grade books in a way that supports grading for learning. And that's going to be hosted with David Woodward and Katie Boudreau. So we thank you both so much for joining us today. We can't wait to share this out with everyone. And that's a good afternoon and a farewell.